Hi, my name is Gerhard Schwartner, and welcome to our webinar. We appreciate you signing up, and you're in for a treat. Today, we'll talk about digital onboarding strategies. And for this webinar, we are very lucky to have Richard Barkey. He is founder and CEO with Imparta. And you're right now in London, right?
Actually in Warwickshire, in the deep English countryside. So yes, it's a bit dark here right now.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't we jump right in? And I want to tell the audience, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So when you have questions that pop in your mind, please type them in. I will do a little bit of a triage when your questions come in. And there's always one question that pops up in every webinar, which is, are we recording this? And yes, we are recording this today. So you will get an email if you have signed up and attended. We will send you an email with a link to the recorded webinar. So Richard, let's talk about Imparta. What is your secret sauce to success?
There are three that I usually say, three things I usually say when I'm asked that question. The first is, we are active in sales and sales through service and service around the world. And I think there are three things that you need to do that really well. The first is superb methodologies. It's our 21st birthday this year, so we've been doing this a while with very large companies around the world. So the methodology is the first thing. The second is the way that you do the teaching and the learning. And I founded Imparta on the back of my belief in experiential learning. So not learning through lectures, but learning through experiences and following Kolb's learning cycle, which I'll come on to in the webinar actually. And then finally, having what I suppose you could term a lean change wrapper around that learning to make sure that it sticks. So we have a thing called the capability building system that we've invested a lot of time and money in, with a digital enabling platform behind it that helps that learning to stick. So if you can kind of have the right content, train it the right way, and make it stick, then in my book, that's a good formula.
That's awesome. So let's move to the next slide, and I'd like for the audience to see the thought that went behind it, because you combine sales service and sales through service in a way that I've never seen it before. Can you walk us through this quickly?
Sure, yeah. I guess sales never operates in a vacuum, and it's part of obviously the go-to-market function in the organization. And so sales and service are both ways that you deliver the strategy and the brand to the customers of the organization. So for us, kind of combining sales and service has always been something we've done. And the sales through service aspect, which is particularly relevant in retail, in hospitality, and so on, has actually grown as a percentage of our business. So in a way, it's more the B2C end of selling. So we do everything from high-end B2B sales right down to kind of retail. The philosophy of being client-centric and bringing insight to the table is there across that spectrum, but they're slightly different kind of versions of what we do. So it's all about empowering the go-to-market part of the organization. In the outer ring there, you'll see we also have expertise in marketing and in leadership as an enabler for those other things. And actually, a lot of the really interesting stuff in this space happens in the overlap between those areas, in the way that sales interacts with marketing and the way that sales and service interact. So it's a simple sounding area of focus, but it's endlessly fascinating. It's kept me going for a long time.
Well, I like the image because it suggests that we're dealing with a dynamic system, and there's a certain methodology required for optimizing that system and go into high growth mode. Mm-hmm. So can you share a little bit about how we can optimize the system to turn this into a growth engine?
Well, if you look at the pieces individually and then talk about how they combine. I think within sales, I mean, there's a lot of stuff around what's new in sales, and for me, sales is ever changing, and the only way you can really stay up to date in sales is to be deeply customer focused, so that you are constantly tracking what the customer is doing, how their decision process changes, and adapting your sales methodology to what the customer is demanding at any given time. I would say in the last 18 months, I've seen the sales approach that we have to take in our market has changed quite a lot. And then around the service side, service is a way of delivering the brand promise, if you like. So the promises that you set up as the salespeople take an organization around a buying cycle are then delivered through the product, but also through the way the organization engages through the service team. So you can look at them separately, but there is a lot of synergy in making sure that the brand promises on the one hand and the brand delivery on the other hand line up very well. And of course, they all have to link to the corporate strategy too.
Absolutely. And one of the key elements is onboarding. Yes. Can you share sort of the process and what sales leaders need to think about in order to make onboarding as efficient as possible?
Let's do that. So, I mean, do you mind if I dive into some of the slides here, Gerhard? Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's walk through them. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. So, I guess one of the questions that I always ask myself as the chief executive of a company is what's driving our growth. And there are several things. Products, market expansion can drive the growth of a business, but in reality, the sales team is at the heart of the growth strategy, the organic growth strategy, at least for most organizations. So the ability to increase the size of that engine, the capacity of that engine, if you like, is really, really critical. And as you and I were talking a few days ago, Gerhard, one of the issues is that the cost of hiring a new salesperson and having that salesperson on board for the first year is actually surprisingly high. So we had a little poll for those of you who have joined us on the webinar, and by the way, thank you for joining us. If you just imagine a fairly typical, B2B sales salary of about $110,000, that's the salary component. What do you think would be the total cost of a new hire at that salary level in the first year, their first year of employment? So if you could, just choose one of those answers: 110 to 150,000, 150 to 200, 200, 300, or if you're feeling bold, 300 plus. Let's see what you think as a group. We'll just give you a few seconds to choose one of those. Gut feel is all that's needed. No calculators necessary. So Amanda, I think should we show the poll results there? Okay, so 38% say 200 to 300, 33% 150 to 200, a third, it's roughly a third, and nobody thinks 110 to 150, which I would agree with. The costs are much higher than that, obviously. And if we go back to the slides, thank you very much. We have a little tool, and I'm going to send you a link when we do a follow-up email to a white paper that covers what we'll talk about today, and to this little tool for calculating the cost to your organization on average of a new sales hire. And it asks things like, how much time is spent interviewing, what do you spend on other assessment tools, how many of the hires that you make don't work because you have to apply the cost of those failed hires on average to everybody else. So you can actually do a reasonably accurate calculation for your own organization. But typically, I would actually go with the majority on that poll and say, for an average kind of salesperson, the cost in that first year is about $274,000, or about $274,000, which is, over 2.5 times the cost of that person in the first place, the salary cost. So it's a really major cost, and you have to add on to that the opportunity cost of lost sales in the period where people are getting up to speed. So you don't want to lose good salespeople, and you want to make sure that you hire the right ones and then that they're onboarded as quickly as possible. And that speed, again, as we were discussing earlier this week, Gerhard, that speed is really important. So the Sales Management Association did some research, and they said that they reckoned that a consistent, well-structured sales onboarding process can reduce the ramp-up time for a new salesperson from just a shade over 9 months on average down to just under, well, nearly 5.5 months. And that's about a 40% improvement in speed. Now, if you think about the people who do get to their first revenue in 5 months as being what we would call sprinters, they're the people who get to the finish bar of revenue very quickly. On the right-hand side of this slide, you've got that 270-odd thousand cost. I've made some assumptions here about quota and gross margin. So I've assumed a $750,000 quota and a 64% gross margin after commission, just some rough figures. So for 5 months, you've got cost of 274K, a contribution from the margin of about 280. So the net cost is pretty much zero. And if you've got 10 people you're hiring, it's still zero, which is nice. If it's 9 months, on the other hand, the net cost to you of that salesperson in the first year is $150,000. And if you've got 10 of them, that's $1.5 million. Now, you might have the cash to hire those people and to carry that loss in the first year, but it's a heck of a drain and a drag on your ability to grow the sales team quickly, because you don't want to take a huge hit on EBITDA. So moving that onboarding time from 9 months down to 5 months has a big impact on profit, but it also has a huge impact on the more strategic issue of your ability to ramp up the size of the sales team quickly in response to changing market conditions and a desire for growth. So that's kind of the framing of this whole session, really, is that getting the speed to onboarding down is both a tactical and a strategic driver of value, and it's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about for our organization as well as those of our clients. So I guess if I just move on to the next slide here, the way I like to think about things, so I was an engineer by background, so I like to think in equations. Before McKinsey turned my brain into a 2x2 matrix, and I came up with what I'm calling the onboarding equation. I love David Maister's trust equation, so this is my homage to the trust equation, if you like. And I would say that the time it takes for a salesperson to hit revenue is equal to the time they spend learning, plus the time they spend waiting for the right deal to be put in front of them, plus the time they spend selling, in other words, going through the buying cycle and closing a deal, divided by proficiency. So if somebody's very good, that sales time can be reduced. But in many cases, in many organizations, the learning time and the waiting time can't be reduced by the skill of the salesperson, because it's more of a sheep dip process. So time to revenue is learning plus waiting plus selling time divided by how good the salesperson is. And I guess if you use that as a model, it's quite interesting to then drill down into what some of the challenges are that organizations have that drive up each of those bits of time, because obviously we want to bring the time down as much as possible. So if I look at the months people spend learning, some of the challenges there are the cost and the availability of induction training. So if you're waiting for a big group of people to be assembled so that you can, you've got enough people to do classroom training, you're going to have to introduce an extra delay there. A lot of training, especially if it's done with webinars or it focuses on product training, is good at transferring knowledge, but less good at building skill. Everybody has different needs, so everybody has different skills and different learning preferences, and especially if you're hiring a lot of millennials, that is a challenge for the time and the effectiveness of onboarding. And finally, in this area, a lot of content gets out of date quite quickly, so retraining is often necessary at the end of existing onboarding programs. Then we move on to the months people spend waiting for that first client engagement. And the challenges here are that sometimes the opportunities to engage clients early on are actually quite limited. And even more than that, managers are quite risk averse. So they're often giving relatively poor leads to new hires and saving the good leads for people that they trust more to deliver that revenue. Or they're kind of being too conservative in how long they make people wait before they deem them to be ready to go in front of a customer. And our experience, both in the equation and reality, is that the sooner you engage somebody in a real customer situation, the quicker they are to get up to speed. Then we have months spent selling, and deal allocation doesn't always take into account how quickly the likely sales cycle will be. But if you want somebody to a deal that's going to be relatively quick, will build their confidence, build their experience in a short time frame, and allow them to overperform thereafter. The other thing here is that new sales hires, are typically very bad at one thing in particular, and that is building momentum in a sale. You give them a pitch and they can figure out how to do it, but building momentum requires really good stakeholder skills, really good questioning and listening skills, and a good product understanding, not just of what the product is, but what the pain points are that it addresses. So we don't always focus enough on helping new people to build momentum in a sale. And then finally, proficiency. Partly it's about who you hire for your onboarding engine, because bad salespeople are still pretty good at selling themselves. So it's relatively easy to make mistakes in sales hires unless you are very rigorous in the way you do it. And also you've got a new person joining a manager's team without enough data, which you can get, but without that data, the managers don't necessarily know those people well enough to be able to coach them properly. So all of those are challenges in each of the areas of that ramp-up equation. And I wanted to refer, if it's okay with you, Gerhard, back to an example. We do a lot of work with Cisco, and their global virtual sales organization took a long, hard look at its induction program a few years ago, and they had a number of pretty significant challenges that we were able to help with. So the solution to these things, the solution to the month spent learning is what I would term Agile Induction. To the month spent waiting is early engagement with customers. To the selling time is kind of a focus on speed when we're looking at deal allocation. And proficiency, improving proficiency is all about candidate selection and then coaching in the field. So that was some of the impact that we were able to do for Cisco. And of course, digitization covers every aspect of organizations nowadays, and no less so in onboarding. It's a crucial tool to allow onboarding to happen much more quickly. And I'm obviously not going to talk about a product in particular, but we do have a thing that we built for Cisco called the Virtual Sales Academy, which we found was really capable of solving these problems. So just to touch on the Cisco situation a little bit more, the global virtual sales team, oops, overshot. There's a bit of delay when I press a button back to the States. So the challenge they had was that they had a very large, very millennial new intake group every year, a few hundred people, and they were dispersed geographically, and they were using essentially 40 or 50 hours of webinars to train those people in product across all of Cisco's architectures and in sales methodology. Now, the challenge was that webinars are not a terribly good fit with the way millennials like to learn. It didn't feel state of the art, and obviously Cisco, being a high-end technology company, wanted to have something that felt fitting for what they did. And also very simple practical things like, because people were dispersed around the world, a webinar happening at the right time in America isn't the right time in Tokyo. And so there were some very practical challenges there. But more to the point, it was hard to really drive early engagement with customers on the back of those webinars, and it was also very expensive to run. So what I'm going to do is, if it's okay with you, just talk through very quickly each of those elements of the equation and talk more generally about how you can improve these speeds, but also touch on what we did and what we still do with Cisco. So let's touch first on speeding up learning with Agile Induction. And e-learning is obviously a very easy way to do induction training and any kind of sales training. It's on demand, so you don't have to wait for a big group of people. The marginal cost is relatively low. So when we did research into this, I think it was about 250 odd companies that we researched. 71% agreed that cost savings are a strong benefit of sales e-learning. About half felt that salespeople prefer e-learning, but only a third felt that sales training through e-learning is effective, very effective. And there lies the problem. Sales e-learning is very appealing for lots of reasons, but it doesn't necessarily work. And it doesn't work because it's not great at delivering skill improvement. Again, it's okay for knowledge transfer, but not necessarily great for skill building. And the reason for that goes back to something I touched on earlier, which is experiential learning. One of my heroes is a guy called David Kolb, who came up with this thing called the experiential learning cycle. So adults learn skills by having an experience, reflecting on how that goes, going through a process that he called abstract conceptualization, which is essentially coming up with a theory of how you could do this better, and then experimenting, so practicing and rehearsing that skill in the field and then going around the loop again as you refine your skills. Now, a lot of e-learning kind of has a problem here because it starts with theory. It starts with the abstract conceptualization. So here's how you do questioning, or here's how you do pitch strategy, or whatever it might be. So we kind of go, here's what we're going to learn, here's some theory, and then typically, if you're lucky, you get a bunch of quiz questions or some drag and drop exercises that test how well you've understood that theory and allow you to reflect on the answers that you've given. So two problems here. One is there's very little in e-learning that is genuine experience or experimentation. And the second is, even the ones we are doing, conceptualization, reflection, we're doing it the wrong way around. We're starting with the theory and then asking people to reflect, whereas it's actually much more effective to get people reflecting on how they do things now and then give them the theory that they need to do better, because they're then in a more receptive mode for that theory. So when I started Imparta, the technology that I kind of left McKinsey with to start Imparta was simulation based. We were in 1994. I was building kind of dialogue-based simulations for business training, and these simulations are actually a very good way for e-learning to provide that kind of experiential component. And rather than being a decision tree, I describe a good simulation like this as a decision forest, because there are actually many different routes you can go down with memory about what you've said before, so that although you're typically choosing from a list of things to say, you've actually got a great deal of freedom, and they are very non-linear. So in the negotiation sim, for example, you can say one thing, and depending on what you've done up to that point, you get a completely different response, which is kind of cool. So how do we then use the simulations in that framework? Well, we do the simulations twice, basically. So in the very first instance, just waiting for the slide to go forward. Seems to have stopped, but I suspect it's going to jump about 4 forward in a minute. Amanda, can you give me a little hand there? I can't seem to move the slide forward. Oh, there we go. It's going now. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. So the first time we enter the cycle, then we give people an experience with a first take of a simulation, which might be uncovering need, building pain behind that need, crafting a solution, whatever the module is that we're talking about. Then we give people feedback on that and some interviews with customers to explain how they react to different approaches to that task. So that's the reflection bit. Then we give people theory that adapts itself to how they did in the simulation. So we don't go through everything for everybody, but we just, to be efficient, we just go through the theory that people need based on how they did in the simulation. And then, if necessary, they go and do the sim again, applying the skills and the theory that they have to the task, and hopefully demonstrating a much better level of capability the second time around. And actually, then it carries on after the e-learning in the workplace with role plays with the manager potentially, or on-the-job activities. So you can use simulations if you construct it in a way like this that follows Kolb, to actually start to build skills through e-learning in the same way that you would with role plays and exercises that are done well in the classroom. That is embedded into a journey for onboarding, and this is the initial phase, the learning phase of the onboarding. And this is the one for Cisco, and it starts with a personal assessment, a learning plan with your manager, intros, and then a number of modules that take you around the buying cycle, which is the way we think about how to sell. It's a very customer-centric approach, and weaves in the product training with the skill training. So you learn about how to build an awareness of a need in the customer, and then you're going through the architectures with that as a context. So let me talk about switches and routers, but not just what they are, but how the need is built for those products. We've been doing this a few years, and I think it's 2.5 years now, and we've improved things as we've gone, and we're still improving them. And some of the things we've learned are, in learning as an onboarding process, it's really good to start before people join. So you can begin the process before day one. And sometimes the fact that we have the option of using our platform rather than somebody's LMS actually makes it easier for people to begin the learning before they begin. It's important that the journey is adaptive. So if somebody's very skilled, they can do an assessment and agree with their manager. They just need to focus on a couple of areas. And also the content within each module is also adaptive. And that means that we're reducing the time that it takes to go through all this content, and there can be a lot if there's lots of products, to the minimum that's needed for each individual person. Removing manager bottlenecks. So originally we had role plays where the manager was on a phone call with the salesperson with a case study, and they would score an assessment based on what was happening in that case study. And that proved, although it was really popular to begin with, it proved quite tricky because the manager then had to kind of schedule a call with each of their team members. And there were a couple of these things, so it was taking up a lot of time and becoming a bottleneck. So we took that out, and now we're using video-based role plays where the salesperson just kind of records a couple of minutes of a pitch or something on a phone, goes to the manager, they look at that and review it, and it's all done. So de-bottlenecking the learning from the manager's point of view while keeping the managers deeply involved was a key process. And finally, we've constantly been refining and reviewing the way we present data to the managers to help them to coach their teams in the areas where they are strongest and weakest. And that data, I'll come back to that, is very, very powerful and useful. So that's kind of the journey that we look at when we're doing something around onboarding, as with Cisco. And critically, as I mentioned, it talks about that learning journey covers the sales methodology and products and how to sell them, and also where they're sold, so the channels, the target customers, and so on. So you're covering everything people need to know to kind of hit the ground running in their new role. So Cisco found this to be a very useful approach, and there's a few elements to that. One is it was very appealing to the millennial audience. They really loved the kinesthetic aspects of the gamification, the kind of very visual approach to this, and the ability to do it when they wanted in their way, in a way that adapts to them. That ticked a lot of millennial boxes. The kind of customer-centric and buyer cycle approach to selling worked very well. They also liked the fact that in the simulations, for them, we actually built simulations where the product being sold in the simulation is a Cisco product. We We obviously have a generic version of this as well. But learning how to sell in context was very powerful. The manager engagement made a huge difference. So the fact that managers were able to kind of look smart with their teams was very powerful. And I mentioned at the beginning that there was a fairly big cost attached to doing this. Over the course of 2 to 3 years, Cisco estimated they saved about $1 million by doing the induction this way as opposed to the old way. And more than all of that, it's quicker. So you can get people up to speed and into the starting gates of their sales journey much more quickly. So that's the kind of the first of those bits of the equation, the learning part. Let me pause there for a second, go ahead and just ask if there are any questions that you had or that have been coming in on the chat window about that part. And if not, I'll move on to talk about waiting.
I think the one question we need to be clear about, what was the time savings? Because in essence, what you're talking about is, I want to bring it to a very simple formula. You had your mathematical formula earlier, and the American culture, we know that time is money, but technology teaches us that acceleration leads to profitability. And what was how did Cisco measure the ROI on that intervention?
So the financial ROI was the cost of running all the webinars, as opposed to in effect the license fee for the people going through the software version of it. So the $1 million I mentioned was a pure cost saving on that basis.
Right.
The ROI in terms of kind of speed to competency, I don't think they actually quantified a dollar figure on that. But certainly the percentage I mentioned earlier about like a 40% improvement in speed. I mean, the learning part is not the whole of that cycle to getting people up to speed. But I would say that's probably about what we saw in terms of the elapsed time to go through the learning. The challenge is sometimes the product training piece, where products change really, really quickly. So having to make the product element of what we do, if that's included in this kind of onboarding, we have to make that agile as well so that it can be updated really quickly. Otherwise, you end up having to go back and kind of retrain people in some of the product pieces that might have changed. So the onboarding bit gets squished down, but you need to make sure that the pieces that need updating are updated on a regular basis, I would say.
And another quick question that pops up is, good stuff. How does creativity play a specific key role in leveraging sales? And how do you use creative, unconventional ideas, approaches, and solutions beyond those you covered here to give your customers a competitive edge? I'm curious myself. How do you stimulate creativity in the onboarding process?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So I guess for me, creativity comes because the experience you give people at the beginning of that cycle is open-ended. There's no finite number of ways that they can go through it, because it's non-linear, even though you're choosing sometimes the things you want to say from a list. And we tend to have a bit of a sense of humor, so we'll build in some fairly wacky ways to approach the problem that can include you getting thrown out of the room, or even finding a novel way to solve the problem that's in front of you. So the way the onboarding is constructed is designed to get people to extend themselves and to try and be creative in the way they approach a problem and learn what works and what doesn't. But beyond that, I think so in martial arts there's a concept of kata and bunkai. And kata is where you learn the moves, the karate chop, the kick, whatever it might, the block, whatever it might be. And bunkai is where you put that into action in a kind of controlled almost sparring setting. And what we find is that even when you're using e-learning, the manager's role, or sometimes an external coach's role, is critical to help drive the application in a kind of a sparring way. So we call it deal coaching or pursuit coaching. Sometimes we teach the managers to do that, sometimes we do it. And it's there where I guess you really drive the creativity, because you've given people the tools and the skills, and then you're pushing them to apply those skills in a real situation. So I spent most of, not yesterday, but 2 days ago, with one of our clients in London, actually, working through with their intact account teams. We had some people in the States, some people in the room in London, and we spent the best part of a day going through about a $16 million opportunity and really pushing them on the skills that they'd learned in the classroom, but then going, okay, so how do you apply that? Let's do a value map. Let's look at the stakeholders and really challenge your thinking. And that was amazingly powerful and exciting to see them kind of getting all of those aha moments about how to approach a real opportunity. So I think there are lots of opportunities for creative training, but also to push creativity in the field afterwards.
Well, I second that, and I also believe that you know, as we become more and more digitized, we need to change the perspective. We're leaving the linear world, and we are entering a more dynamic world. And you know, the early promises from CRM was get a 360-degree view of the customer. But I think we need to apply that perspective on the customer's problem. So we need a 360-degree view of the customer's problem, which means to examine the problem from different angles and then tease out more possibilities. And by just moving from a rigid approach to a dynamic approach, we can be more creative.
And going back to what you were asking earlier, Gerhard, about the service and sales interaction, if you can bring an intact sales team, including the service people, into a room to talk about an opportunity or an account development plan, so much the better, because there you get people who are often not asked that question, but who actually know the stakeholders and know the issues that are being faced day to day. And you bring them into the mix, and it stimulates a whole different level of conversation at that point. It's really exciting.
Awesome.
So should we talk about waiting?
Yeah.
And this is a really interesting one, I think. And I mean, this actually doesn't have much to do with technology, but I think it's, you know, from a business point of view, if you're trying to drive down the time to revenue, this is kind of a critical area. So early engagement, if I think about sprinters, and we did quite a lot of research into what makes somebody a sprinter, somebody who can get to revenue in 5 months rather than 9 or more. And one of the things that we found was that a lot of sprinters had benefited from being introduced into a customer situation very early in their tenure, maybe even before they were fully up to speed in the products and services of the organization. So you don't have to do things in sequence, you know, learn, then get the right deal, then get on with it. Sometimes you can overlap things in parallel. And that injection into the heart of a customer situation built their confidence. It allowed them to try things out in a safe way. And for good people, it was easier to leapfrog from a warm contact to other people in that organization or even other organizations than it was to kind of crack the shell of a cold prospect. So that early introduction, earlier than you would naturally think about doing it, was really important. And when we looked at kind of where people found those opportunities, sometimes it was shadowing an existing opportunity, teaming with an existing salesperson to get involved in an opportunity. But sometimes it was just going, well, look, we've had, you know, so many hundreds of leads come in. Not all of them have been properly chased down. So let's pick a few that we could actually give to the new people and say, go and double check. You know, this was marked as return to marketing. Go and double check, have a chat with them and see if there's anything we could do. And sometimes they did find things, but even if not, they were engaging the enemy, if you like, in a way that built their confidence. And also finding accounts where we haven't grown for a long time, or we're only selling to one part of the organization, or only selling one part of our product and service capability. those what I call comfort zone accounts are also fair game for introducing, not necessarily replacing the salesperson, but introducing a new person to that team to bring a fresh pair of eyes and also learn the ropes as they go. So that early injection into a client situation is very powerful. And of course, if you do it quickly, it gets you with that kind of the waiting part of the equation being much shorter. And then you get into the third part, which is the selling piece. And I've put here focus on speed. And what I mean by that is two things, really. So there are a range of different accounts and opportunities in any organization, as you know. And some of those will have a relatively long buying cycle, and some will have a fairly short one. And generally, you want to give new people a shorter buying cycle opportunity, not a longer one. And generally, you want to put them into something that is late stage in the buying process. So we talk about the awareness of needs phase, where you're trying to get the client, or they're doing it for themselves, to recognize that they could do things better than they are currently. Assessment of alternatives, where they're considering their options. Alleviation of risk, where they have a preferred option, but they're trying to mitigate some of the downsides at a tactical level, maybe a strategic or even an individual level. The decision and achievement of results. Now, a lot of things that come in with an RFP will be in that assessment of alternatives phase, and that's also a pretty good place to start for a new person, because it's easier and quicker. And the faster they have a win and the faster they get that experience under their belt, the more quickly they'll get to big revenue. And actually, the research that we did showed they will generally do better. So speed doesn't just correlate with break even in the first year, but it also drives long-term performance. And of course, a lot of managers see that as a zero-sum game. So if I give a new person one of those accounts, I'm taking it away from an existing salesperson. The thing is, though, that because you then help that new person to be an overperformer, if you do that, it's actually not a zero-sum game. You end up making the whole team more effective and more productive if you do that. That doesn't mean you just put them with the CEO of your best customer and walk away, of course. You're going to have to coach them hard and use shadowing and teaming to protect the downside. But engagement early is very, very important. There is another aspect to speed that I mentioned earlier, and that is that one thing that a lot of new hires are very bad at is building momentum. So, in our view, and a lot of our sales IP I worked on with Neil Rackham, who many of your attendees will know. I met Neil when I was at McKinsey, and we built this Creating Client Value program based on his research and as a kind of a separate thing from what he was doing with his company at the time. And one of the things that Neil and I used to talk about a lot was pain and gain. So if you have a client who sees that inaction is hurting, they have pain, but they can't see the upside, they're not going to act. Whereas, but also, if they can see the benefit of doing something, but there's no pain from not doing it, then equally, it's a nice to have. And it's only when you can build pain and then gain. So there's got to be some pain, and my loss aversion then kicks in. So I want to act to reduce that pain. And I also believe that a benefit is possible. When you have both of those, you start to build urgency, and then you have to debottleneck the decision process within the client's organization or the customer's organization. So those two things are quite complicated. They're not simple skills, and they're not actually very intuitive. So a lot of salespeople like to solve problems. They don't like to ask questions to dig away and find out how bad things are right now. So coaching hard to help people to build momentum in a sale and to be the guide and the trainer almost of the person making the decision is a very good way to speed up that kind of selling piece of the equation.
And also the momentum goes hand in hand with the creation of confidence in the salesperson.
Yes. Yeah, it does. It does. And I guess that's just to finish off quickly, and I want to give us time for more questions at the end, so I'll whiz through this a bit. But the proficiency piece is obviously something that makes the sale go quicker and to be more valuable. And I think most of us are in industries where the product itself, the intrinsic value of the product is probably less important than the value that we as a company, and especially the sales team, deliver during the sale process. So with Proficiency, there's a number of issues, and partly it's about hiring the right people. It's about hiring people who are going to be skilled in the role. One thing I probably wish I'd known 20 years ago, and we spent a lot of time working on improving hiring processes internally and for clients, is salespeople are notoriously good at selling themselves. So you need to test an observable skill. So we always do actually simulations and a role play meeting where we get to see somebody, even in a very simple way, doing a sale process. And I very quickly can tell whether somebody is, consultative and insight-based and asking the right questions versus, the kind of the walking catalog approach. So a rigorous selection process is critical, as is having an early warning indicator for poor hires. So if you have somebody who sticks around for 2 years before you realize they're not the right fit, that's a very, very expensive mistake, both in terms of the cost of that person and the opportunity cost of having a bad person in that role. So not looking at output indicators, but looking at leading indicators like how many clients have they engaged with, what have they identified in terms of critical buying factors, etc. Leading indicators to give you early warning when somebody is not a right fit, and not just relying on that big deal that's always around the corner, which is a very easy thing for a salesperson to kind of fall back on, as we know. So you've got the right person. You also need the platform that's doing the onboarding training to work after that initial onboarding. So you've got the journey in the top left there, but the platform can also deliver competency-based training. So if you know that somebody has a weak point, as you can see here, in, let's say, alleviating risks, the manager or they themselves can drill down into that module. And I am a big believer in a modular approach to sales learning and negotiation and account management. So you can focus reinforcement and additional learning based on the competency profile that you build up for that individual. So there's a course bit, there's a competency-based learning, and then finally there's kind of a contextual learning where you're applying a tool in a real situation, and the system can give you that tool and provide learning around that to help you, whether that's on an app or in Salesforce or however you want to consume that. So a learning process that continues after that initial onboarding is key, as is adoption and reinforcement. So we have a product called eCards that sends out a question on a regular basis to people that stimulates thinking about a problem in a particular area. And then if they get it wrong, it drives them to revise that section of the content. And what's clever about that is the way that the algorithms, which are AI-based, take into account where somebody's strengths and weaknesses are from lots of different data points, and provide a frequency and a topic of questions that adapt themselves to the strengths and especially the weaknesses of that individual. So we're not bothering people who are good, but the people who are weaker are getting kind of challenged to make them go and rethink things. And that kind, there are different ways to do that, but that kind of ongoing reinforcement really helps to drive proficiency in the longer term. I talked about insight for managers. So, whatever system you use for onboarding, you want it to give you in-depth insights into where somebody's strong, where they're weak. Some of you out there will know of Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of learning measurement. Reaction: did somebody like it? Did they understand it? Can they do it? And what's the business impact? For me, there's, in addition to reaction at the low level of that, there's also something around engagement. Are they engaged with the learning? Are they really focused on how they can apply this stuff in the field? And then finally, managers themselves, managing and coaching especially is not a very easy skill, and it's not a skill that every single sales manager is good at. We all know people who've been promoted into sales management roles because they were really good salespeople and aren't necessarily equipped yet with the right skills. So it's important in an onboarding process to make sure that the managers who have those teams are refreshed or trained if they haven't been in coaching, and have tools, so account troubleshooters or coaching tools, and even coach the coach services, so have somebody from the outside who observes them occasionally working with their team and then takes them aside and gives them coaching on their coaching skills. That can be very effective. In my experience, coaching itself is probably one of the skills that needs the most coaching and the most measurement to make sure that it sticks. People can slide away from coaching very easily. So that's kind of a quick scamper through this equation. So, speeding up learning, making it agile, reducing waiting time by engaging people with customers early, reducing time to sell through the selection of opportunities that you give salespeople, and improving proficiency through the way you choose the people in the first place and the quality of the learning, but also the way you reinforce that learning ongoing. And if you get all of those things right, you're definitely going to be looking more at the lower end of the time to revenue than the upper end. And best of all, given the cost of a new sales hire, the Society for Human Resource Management reckons that a good sales onboarding process can make it 69% more likely that a new hire stays in the company for up to 3 years. And that can have a very big financial impact as well. So it's a strategically important issue, this. I consider it that for me. So what we're trying to do with the onboarding process is to build something that's kind of a lot more effective than traditional e-learning for not a lot of extra effort and cost, although there is some because you've got to engage the managers and so on properly, but not the same cost as a full kind of face-to-face sales academy. And then finally, Gerhard, I wanted to make an offer to everybody who's very kindly joined us and who will be watching the video afterwards. There are two things I wanted to share with you, and we'll send around an email at some point soon after the webinar over the next day or two, that links through to two things. One is a white paper that covers the topics I've been talking about and provides some ideas and additional thought starters for you. There'll be some stuff on the Virtual Sales Academy, the platform that we have and that we use at Cisco that does all of this, but I'm trying to give some principles that work if that's not of interest to you, if you just want to improve the approach that you already have. And then finally, there's a spreadsheet which you can see on the right-hand side there, which I mentioned earlier, lets you calculate the cost of a sales hire for you, but also then goes through and says what's the impact of that on your break-even point, and then allows you to score yourself against all the criteria I've talked through, and maybe come up with a few action points that you might want to consider to reduce that critical time to first revenue. So we'll send you links to those, and I hope they're helpful. I am extremely happy to talk about this stuff. Imparta, we have our US office or US company, Imparta Inc., is headquartered in New York City, and Steve Lund, who is the head of Imparta Inc., is on the call right now, and he's available with his team in the States to talk. I'm happy to talk as well, but we'd love to engage with lots of you about this very interesting area. So happy to answer any questions that you or anybody else has, Gerhard.
Thank you so much, Richard. I want to thank you for putting a lot of thought and a lot of work into this and sharing that case with Cisco. And there's a lot of confusion about online learning. Why was that utopian idea, like from 5 years ago, that we need to move from classroom to online? Why didn't that pan out the way it was supposed to?
Well, I can't remember how long you've been in this business, Gerhard, but I think it's neither of us are spring chickens, right? And I've seen this happen. I've seen the cycle go around at least 3 times since I started Imparta 21 years ago. and there's a cycle of kind of e-learning is the great thing, and sometimes it's driven by cost. So when the tech bubble burst in 2001, suddenly e-learning was the thing because cost reduction was the big agenda. Sometimes it's driven by more technology excitement and adaptivity and big data and so on. And for me, the reason that a lot of e-learning then gets adopted but then gets dropped is two things actually. One is just that a lot of it isn't constructed in the right way, so it doesn't actually build skill. It's knowledge transfer, but then people find they still have to train people up in a classroom or with a lot of attention in the field to give them the right skills. It's one thing, literally one thing, to have a presentation, whether it's in a webinar or on an e-learning slide, about questioning skills. Is quite another to kind of try that out and see how you do. So I think it's partly that a lot of e-learning doesn't have that experiential element. And then I think the other thing is, well, I guess there's two other things. One is that there's always value in getting together with people, and people like to spend time with people. For me, that time is best used in application and practice rather than the fundamental learning. But we do that too. I mean, we run, thousands of face-to-face workshops around the country, in the States and elsewhere in the world. So I'm not against that. It can work very well if you use it for application. And then I guess the final thing is, if you're doing product training through software, you have to be very clever to make sure that it's agile and doesn't get out of date too quickly. So those are my three. What do you think?
Maybe you can help us by sort of delineating the terms e-learning and a digital sales onboarding strategy. Where's the difference?
Great. So e-learn. So in the process of creating what I call an agile sales enablement tool, the learning is, if you like, the atom. It's the central atom of each skill module, right? And e-learning typically means, whether it's simulation based or something else, it's a way of giving somebody an opportunity to absorb knowledge and practice the result. There's around that atom is a bunch of other stuff that needs to circulate. So things like competency assessment, things like application tools, correlation with CRM data, figuring out which accounts you're going to put people into. So for me, if I take any given skill or competency, depending on your preference of term, the learning is at the center of it, but then you have all the kind of change wrapper that goes around it that gives you the difference between the learning and an actual sales enablement platform. For me, that's the difference. It's plus. So learning is a subset of the agile sales enablement platform. And by the way, I use the word agile a lot, and I use it carefully. And we've been doing a lot of research into the application of agile approaches to selling, but also to sales management and to sales enablement. I don't have time in the minute left to talk about that properly, but it's, again, another very interesting area. And the key thing about agile is adaptivity and responsiveness and speed. So a good platform will allow people to have something that's tailored to them and will react quickly when they need something different.
So who built the platform? Was that built by Cisco or Imparta? Or was it
we do. So we're a weird mixed-up company with software developers, sales trainers, sales experts, psychologists. So no, it's our platform, and we're constantly evolving it. So we actually have a new announcement in the new year for a new platform or an extension of the existing platform plus a new one that I'm looking forward to sharing with everybody. But no, the Cisco platform is called iCoach, and it's at the heart of our offer. Although the content can be hosted in other LMSs as well. But iCoach is more what I call an academy management system as opposed to a learning management system.
It's fascinating. It's really interesting how you have gone through the digital transformation process of learning and you are on the cutting edge, especially with working with Cisco, where you have a client that's very, very demanding in terms of having.
They're an awesome client to work with. I mean,
Right.
there might be some Cisco people on the call, and they are demanding, and I love it. We adore working with them.
You almost got a college degree in the process.
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you very much for allowing us to ask all those questions, and I want to thank the audience for participating very vigorously, actively, and intelligently. And we will send out an email to everybody where you can get the slides and also your two interesting content assets that I think we can all learn from. Thank you, Richard.
Good. Thank you, Gerhard, and thank you very much to your team and to everybody who's joined the webinar. I really appreciate your time.